The Lakota warrior's eyes were as hard and unforgiving as the Black Hills themselves. Dust and dried blood caked the face of the woman kneeling before him, her expensive dress torn to rags. Her caravan was a smouldering ruin behind them, her guards silent lumps in the tall grass. She'd fought like a cornered cat, but now, with the cold tip of his knife against her throat, the fight was gone. Her voice, though raspy, was clear and steady, a final command in a life full of them. "Just kill me fast," she said. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze fell to the hem of her skirt. With the tip of his knife, he lifted the fabric and saw what they'd branded into her skin. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, empty sky of the Dakota Territory. It beat down on the wreck of the overland wagon, its canvas cover still sending thin tendrils of black smoke into the air. The bodies of 4 men lay scattered where they had fallen, their fancy city clothes and expensive firearms no match for the swift, silent assault. Kneeling in the dirt was the caravan's sole survivor, Abigail Hayes. Her fiery red hair was matted with sweat and grime, her hands bound tightly behind her back with a leather thong. She stared up at the man who stood over her, the leader of the war party. He was tall and lean, his body a map of old scars and new muscle. He moved with a predator's grace, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. His name was Kanji, though the white men he hunted knew him only as the Raven. Abigail had seen death before. She had orchestrated it, profited from it, and fled from it. She knew the look of a man who was about to kill. There was no pleasure in his eyes, no rage, just a quiet, methodical purpose. She knew begging would be useless. It would only grant him satisfaction. Defiance was all she had left. "Get it over with," she rasped, her throat raw from smoke and thirst. "Just kill me fast." Kanji's dark eyes surveyed her, taking in the expensive, ruined silk of her dress, the single pearl earring that somehow still clung to her earlobe, the soft, uncalloused hands that spoke of a life far from this harsh land. He had tracked this caravan for 2 days, a serpent of dust moving west from the railhead. He'd expected to find money rifles, perhaps whiskey. He hadn't expected a woman like this, with eyes that held no fear, only a profound weariness. Her finality intrigued him. White women screamed. They pleaded for their children, for God, for mercy. This one invited the blade. It was the request of someone whose life was a heavier burden than her death. His gaze dropped. A length of her fine petticoat was torn near her ankle, revealing the pale skin of her upper thigh. But something else was there, something dark against the white. It was a mark, ugly and stark. He'd seen marks like it before, on the flanks of cattle, on the wooden posts of claimed land, on the broken bodies of his own people. Ignoring her plea, he reached down, not with his hand, but with the tip of his long hunting knife. The cold steel made her flinch, the first sign of fear she'd shown. He hooked the blade under the hem of her heavy skirt and ripped upwards, tearing the fabric to her hip. Abigail let out a strangled gasp of shame and anger twisting against her bonds. "No, just kill me." But Kanji wasn't looking at her as a man looks at a woman. He was looking at the brand. Seared into the flesh of her upper thigh was a symbol, a coiled rattlesnake forming a perfect circle, and in its center, the letter C. The scar was old, but its lines were hideously clear, a permanent declaration of ownership. The air grew still. The other warriors watched their leader, waiting for a sign. Kanji's face, once an impenetrable mask, now showed a flicker of something terrible and ancient. A cold fire ignited in the depths of his eyes. He had seen this exact brand only once before, burned into the door of a trading post, just before its occupants were slaughtered. It was the personal seal of a monster, a ghost who haunted the plains, a man who devoured land and lives with equal appetite. Kangi withdrew his knife from her throat and lowered his voice, the sound a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. He asked a single question, a name that was a curse on the lips of every tribe, from the Platte River to the Powder. Cain Abigail's body went rigid. The blood drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale beneath the dirt. Her eyes wide with shock, and a new, more profound terror locked onto his. The man she thought was her executioner was something far more dangerous. He was a man who knew her keeper. She didn't answer with her voice. She answered with a single slow nod, a tear finally breaking free and tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. And in that silent, shared moment, the world shifted. He was no longer her captor, and she was no longer his victim. They were something else, entirely survivors of the same fire, marked by the same devil. The shared name hung in the oppressive heat between them, an invisible chain that bound them more securely than any rope. Silas Cain, a man who was less a man and more a force of nature, a blight that spread across the land, poisoning everything he touched. Kangi stood his movements deliberate and sheathed his knife. The sudden absence of the blade at her throat was more unnerving than its presence. He gestured to one of his warriors, a young man named Chaitin, and spoke a few sharp, guttural words. Abigail couldn't understand the language, but the meaning was clear. Chaitin approached, cut her bonds, and then stepped back, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Abigail rubbed her raw wrists, her mind racing. Why wasn't she dead? The brand, her deepest shame, the symbol of her bondage, had somehow saved her life. It was a currency she never knew she possessed. She looked from Kangi's stoic face to the smouldering wagon. Inside, a scorched leather satchel, if it had survived, was the reason she ran, and the reason Cain's men would be hunting her until the day she died. Why she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse. "You know him?" It wasn't a question. Kangi turned his gaze toward the western horizon, where the plains shimmered in the heat. Every stone and every blade of grass in this land knows him. He said, his English precise, learned from years of trading and treaties before the world soured. His name is whispered on the wind. It is the cry of the widow. It is the silence where a village once stood. He walked over to one of the dead guards, a portly man in a bowler hat, and nudged the body with his foot. These men wore his brand too, not on their skin, on their souls. He looked back at her. "You were his property." "Why did you run?" Abigail flinched at the word property. It was the truth, and the truth was a razor. A prized horse will still bolt if the whip stings too often, she said, her old defiance returning. And I decided to take the prize money with me. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossed Kangi's face. "You stole from him." "I took back what he stole from others," she corrected, a sharp edge to her voice. She thought of the thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with names, numbers and deeds, a meticulous record of Silas Cain's empire of extortion, murder, and theft. That book was her shield and her death warrant. Kangi's attention was caught by movement on the far horizon. A small, disciplined party of riders, their dust cloud tight and focused. Not a war party, a posse. Cain's men. They were faster than she'd anticipated. "They are coming." Kangi stated, his voice calm. He turned to his warriors, issuing a rapid series of commands. They moved with fluid efficiency, stripping the dead guards of ammunition and canteens, gathering their own spent arrows and preparing the horses. There was no panic, only a grim sense of purpose. Abigail stood her legs unsteady. "They won't stop. They'll track me to the ends of the earth. Today the earth ends at the Cheyenne River, Kangi said. He pointed to a sturdy-looking pony, one of the caravan's pack animals that had survived. You will ride. She stared at him, bewildered. You're taking me with you. Silas Kane killed my wife and my son. He said the words, falling like stones into a deep well. The emotionless facade finally cracked, revealing a chasm of grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from around him. His men came to our winter camp. They were looking for Yellow Rock. They found only women, children, and old men. They left only ghosts. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw him not as a savage warrior, but as a man hollowed out by loss. The man who led them Kane's right hand, he carried a branding iron. He wanted to mark our land as his master's. He marked my family instead. The horror of his words washed over Abigail. She had known Silas Kane was a monster, but she had lived in his gilded cage, insulated from the bloodiest of his work. She dealt with his finances, his logistics, the clean, crisp numbers that represented countless unspeakable acts. She had been the architect of the engine, even if she never personally stoked the fire. The foreman, she whispered, her blood running cold. A man named Samuel Baxter, a thick neck and a scar across his nose. Kangi's eyes narrowed into slits. You know him? He was Kane's enforcer, she confirmed, her stomach churning. He oversees acquisitions. A silent understanding passed between them. They were enemies by birth, by culture, by every law of the frontier. But Silas Kane had made them something more. He had made them kin in their hatred. The brand on her leg was a mark of shame, but it was also a map. And Kangi the Raven knew how to read it. He strode over to her and looked down not at her, but at the brand. That mark is your death sentence, he said, but it may also be your salvation. And mine. Kane wants what you stole. His dog Baxter will lead the hunt. They will follow your trail. He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. And we will leave them a trail to follow. But it will not lead to you. It will lead to him. The pace Kangi set was relentless. They rode north away from the established westward trails into the broken, rugged heart of the country. The land was a maze of dry canyons, sharp-edged buttes, and seas of whispering grass that hid rattlesnakes and rocky pitfalls. For Abigail, who had spent the last 5 years traversing the country in cushioned carriages and private rail cars, it was a brutal education. Every muscle ached. Her skin was burned by the sun and chafed raw by the rough leather of the saddle, and a constant gnawing thirst was her only companion. They stopped only when darkness made travel impossible. The Lakota warriors would melt into the landscape, setting up a camp that was nearly invisible with a small, smokeless fire tucked into a rock crevice. They shared dried meat and water, and while the other warriors watched her with open suspicion, Kangi treated her with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. On the third night, as they sat by the fire's embers under a blanket of stars so thick it felt like you could touch them, he finally broke the silence. "Tell me about him," Kangi said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a judge's order. Not the stories. The man. Abigail hugged her knees to her chest, the borrowed buffalo hide rough against her cheek. The physical misery was a welcome distraction from the memories he was forcing her to unearth. "I met him in St. Louis," she began, her voice a low murmur. "I was a widow. My husband, a clerk, had died of cholera, leaving me with a pile of debts and a talent for mathematics. I was working as a bookkeeper for a shipping company. Silas Kane came in one day to acquire it. He didn't bargain or threaten. He simply presented the owner with evidence of a smuggling operation the man was running and then offered him a pittance for the entire business. The man took it grateful to avoid the gallows. She paused, remembering the force of Cain's presence. He wasn't a large man, but he filled a room. He dressed in tailored suits, his voice was soft and cultured, and his eyes were the pale, flat grey of a winter sky just before a blizzard. He found me poring over the ledgers that night, correcting the cooked books. He was impressed by my efficiency. He said, "Numbers are the purest form of truth, Miss Hayes. They don't lie, and they don't feel pity. You understand that." He offered me a job. What job? Kangi asked, his gaze fixed on her face. "He called me his cartographer," she said with a bitter laugh. I didn't draw maps of land. I drew maps of power. I tracked his assets, identified his competitors' weaknesses, calculated the precise financial pressure needed to break a man, to ruin a family, to acquire a rail line or a silver mine for pennies on the dollar. I was the architect of his empire, all from a mahogany desk, 1,000 miles from the blood. She described the world she had inhabited, a world of telegrams, stock prices, and leveraged buyouts. Silas Cain was a pioneer of a new kind of warfare, one fought with ink and paper. He discovered that it was cheaper to bankrupt a rancher than to fight him. He could seize a homestead with a fraudulent loan document more easily than with a gun. He was building a kingdom, not just of land, but of debt. Every politician, sheriff, and judge in the territory seemed to owe him something. He liked to collect things. Abigail continued, her voice trembling slightly as the memories grew darker. Rare books, fine art. People. He saw me as a beautiful, clever object. He gave me gowns and jewels, but they were a cage. And he marked his most prized possessions. She instinctively touched her thigh, the phantom heat of the branding iron, still a vivid memory. It had happened years ago, in a wine-fueled fit of possessive rage after she had danced with a visiting senator. He'd had Baxter hold her down. He'd told her it was a symbol of her eternal loyalty, a secret they would share. It was the moment she knew she was not his partner but his slave. I stayed because I was a coward, she confessed, the words tasting like ash, and because I had nowhere to go. But he grew more reckless. The numbers I managed started to be soaked in more and more blood. Then I heard whispers of what happened at a Lakota winter camp. Baxter was bragging about it. He called it clearing an account. The air grew cold. Kangi's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife. "That's when I decided to run," Abigail said. But I couldn't leave empty-handed. For 3 years, I kept a secret ledger, my own set of books. Every illegal transaction, every bribe, every name of every man he had murdered, every village he had destroyed. It's all in there. His entire empire detailed in numbers and names, the purest form of truth. "Where is this ledger?" Kangi asked, his voice tight. Abigail looked towards the pack pony, which was hobbled nearby. Tucked into a false bottom of a scorched leather satchel was the book. It was in my wagon. I believe it survived the fire. Kangi stood and walked to the satchel. He pulled it from the pony's back, and after a moment of searching found the hidden compartment. He withdrew a heavy oilskin-wrapped package. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a thick black ledger. He opened it, but the pages were filled with columns of figures and elegant looping script that meant nothing to him. He looked at her, the book in his hands. "This is your weapon." "It's a bomb," she corrected. "In the right hands, a federal judge, an honest newspaper editor in the East, it could bring him down. That's why he'll never stop hunting me. That book proves he's not just a ruthless businessman. He's a traitor, a murderer, and a thief on a scale they've never seen. It's the story of how the West was truly won." Kangi closed the book, his expression grim. He understood now. She wasn't just a runaway slave. She was a saboteur. She carried the very heart of his enemy in a leather-bound book. He had thought his quest was one of simple revenge, a warrior hunting the man who had wronged him. But Abigail Hayes had shown him a different path. It wasn't enough to kill Silas Kane. He had to be erased. His legacy, his empire, his very name had to be burned from the land, just as he had burned Kangi's village. He wrapped the ledger and placed it back in the satchel. Baxter will not be hunting for a woman anymore, he said, returning to the fire. He is hunting for a ghost, and we will use this ghost to draw him into a trap. He looked at her, his eyes holding a new steely resolve. You were Kane's cartographer. Now you will draw a new map, a map that leads his dog Baxter to his grave. The days that followed forged a strange and silent pact between them. Kangi taught Abigail the brutal necessities of survival. He showed her how to find water, how to read the tracks of men and animals, how to move without a sound. He gave her a knife and taught her how to use it, his hands guiding hers with an impersonal, firm touch. She in turn began to shed the trappings of her old life. The torn silk dress was replaced with a dead man's trousers and shirt. Her soft skin toughened and tanned. The woman who had once commanded fortunes from a desk in St. Louis was being stripped down to her essential core, a survivor. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, they took shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a bluff. The air was thick with the smell of rain and ozone. The other warriors were out scouting the back trail. They were alone. Abigail was cleaning the rifle Kangi had given her, her movements now practiced and efficient. She watched him as he stared out at the darkening plains, his profile etched against the bruised purple sky. He had shared his goal, but not his heart. He remained an enigma, a man driven by a wound she could only imagine. You said he killed your wife and son, she said softly, breaking the long silence. What were their names? Kangi did not turn. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with unshed grief. His name was Magaska. It means white swan. He was small, but his heart was big. He was learning to hunt. He had just fashioned his first real bow. He paused, his throat working. Her name was Wiyake. It means truthful. She saw the world not as it was, but as it should be. She believed there could be peace. He fell silent again, lost in a past that was more real to him than the stone cave around them. Abigail waited, knowing this was a sacred space. A door opened just a crack. Baxter and his men came at dawn in the moon of the popping trees. Kangi continued the memories pouring out of him now. It was cold. Most of our warriors were on a winter hunt, far to the south. Kane had put a bounty on wolf pelts, a clever way to draw the hunters away from the villages he wanted to survey. We learned that later. He turned to look at her, and in the dim light she saw the raw agony in his eyes. They were not soldiers. They were prospectors and railroad men, armed with repeating rifles and whiskey courage. They said our camp was on land granted to the Northern Dominion Railroad by presidential decree. They said we were trespassing. He gave a harsh, empty laugh. Trespassing. On the land where my people had lived for 100 generations. Baxter had the branding iron with him. He said he was posting a notice. He shoved the hot iron against the door of our lodge. Wayake came out. She spoke your language well. She tried to reason with them, to tell them this was a mistake. Magaska ran to stand beside her, holding his little bow. He was trying to protect his mother. Kangi's voice broke. He looked down at his hands, clenching and unclenching them, as if to contain the violence that still simmered within him. Baxter laughed. He said it was fitting that a savage should learn to read his master's name. He shoved Wiako to the ground. Magaska fired his small arrow. It bounced harmlessly off Baxter's thick coat. The cave was silent, save for the rising wind outside. Baxter shot him, Kangji whispered. "My son." He shot him, and then he turned the gun on my wife as she tried to crawl to him. He left them lying there, in front of our home. His men rode through the camp, firing at anyone who moved. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. When we returned, we found what they had left. He had avenged his family in the old way. He and the other returning hunters had tracked the men, picking them off one by one in a week-long running battle. But Baxter and the core of Kane's men had escaped, leaving a trail of bodies and a burning hatred in their wake. "I am no longer Kangi," he said, his voice hardening into the familiar, cold resolve she knew. "That man died with his family. Now I am only a vessel for their memory, a promise I made to their spirits, that I would not rest until the man who signed their death, Warrant Silas Kane, and the dog who carried it out were both wiped from this earth." Abigail's heart ached for him. Her own suffering felt pale and selfish in comparison. She had lost her freedom, her name. He had lost his entire world. She thought of the ledger, her weapon of numbers and ink. It seemed so sterile, so civilized compared to the primal justice he sought. "The ledger can ruin him, Kangi," she said, her voice filled with a new conviction. "But it won't kill Baxter, and it won't put a knife in Kane's heart." Your way. My way. Maybe they are two halves of the same arrow. He looked at her, and a new understanding passed between them. It was not friendship, not yet. It was the grim recognition of fellow soldiers in a war no one else knew they were fighting. He was the spear, and she was the map. He had the strength and the skill. She had the knowledge. Separated, they were merely survivors, haunted by the past. Together they could become hunters. Tomorrow, Kangi said, his voice steady again. The storm within him quelled. For now we stop running. We find a place to make our stand. You will use that book to tell me where Baxter will be. And I will be waiting for him. They made camp in a region of treacherous badlands, known to the Lakota as the Bone Yard. It was a fortress of jagged spires and deep, shadowed ravines, where an army could get lost, but a small, skilled party could command the terrain. It was here they would lay their trap. Abigail Kangji and his two most trusted warriors, Chaitan and the older, grizzled Wanbli, gathered around a low fire. Abigail had the ledger open on her lap, its pages illuminated by the flickering light. For the first time, she was not just a passenger in their flight, but an active commander. Kane is not just a land grabber, she explained, her finger tracing a line of script. He's a logistician. His entire operation depends on a constant flow of supplies west, and a flow of gold, timber, and furs east. He controls the arteries. We can't attack his heart, his fortress, back east, but we can cut one of those arteries. She pointed to a name, Black Creek Supply Depot. Here, she said, it's a new depot, not even on most maps yet. It's strategically placed to funnel supplies to his new mining operations in the Western Hills. According to these records, a massive payroll is due to arrive in 2 days' time. It's delivered by a small, heavily armed crew. They use the old trapper's trail through the gorge right here. She looked up at Kanji. It's not just money. It's gold specie, hard currency to pay his enforcers and bribe the territorial officials. Losing it would cause chaos in his operations. It would be a major blow. He will send men to recover it, Kanji said, his eyes gleaming with understanding. He won't just send men, Abigail corrected. A failure of this magnitude, a direct hit on his wallet. He'll send his best. He'll send the man he trusts to fix problems and punish the guilty. Baxter Kangi finished the name a low growl. The plan was simple in its design and brutal in its potential execution. They would not be a large enough force to take the payroll wagon head-on. They would have to be smarter. Kangi and his warriors would create a rock slide blocking the narrowest part of the gorge. While the guards were distracted, Abigail, using her knowledge of Kane's security protocols, would approach. "They'll be jumpy," she said, her own nerves beginning to fray at the thought. "But they'll recognize me. They'll be confused, but they won't shoot on sight. They've been ordered to bring me back alive. That will be their mistake." The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Kangi and his men worked with a silent, terrifying efficiency, loosening boulders high up on the gorge wall, creating a deadfall trap held in place by a few key stones. Abigail studied the terrain, memorizing every rock and shadow, her mind playing out a dozen different ways the plan could go wrong. A strange camaraderie settled over their small group. Chayton, who had once looked at her with contempt, now showed her a grudging respect. He saw that her mind could be as sharp as any blade. Wanbli the old warrior even shared a piece of his tobacco with her, a quiet gesture of acceptance. They were no longer just Kangi's warriors and his white captive. They were a single unit with a single purpose. On the morning of the 3rd day, the lookout signaled. A dust cloud was approaching from the east. It was time. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She was dressed in the clothes of one of the dead guards from her caravan, a rifle clutched in her hands. Kangi placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, steadying. "You are not the woman I found by the burning wagon," he said. "Remember that." She nodded, took a deep breath, and made her way down to the trail to take her position. Kangi and the others disappeared into the rocks above, becoming one with the landscape. The payroll wagon, a heavy iron-reinforced stagecoach, pulled by 4 strong mules and flanked by 6 outriders, rumbled into the gorge. Just as it reached the designated spot, a sharp crack echoed from the cliffs above, the sound of a single well-aimed rifle shot, shattering one of the key stones. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and earth cascaded down, blocking the trail ahead in a massive, impassable heap. The outriders cursed, pulling their horses up short. The men on the coach leveled their rifles, their eyes scanning the silent cliffs. This was her cue. Abigail stepped out from behind a boulder, her rifle held loosely at her side. "Hold your fire!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. The guards swiveled their rifles, instantly trained on her. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache, squinted. "Miss Hayes, what in God's name?" "There's an ambush ahead," she said, improvising with the lie they had concocted. "My escort was hit. I barely escaped. They're Lakota, a whole war party." The men exchanged nervous glances. Her story was plausible. Her presence, however, was a shock. They had orders about her. "The boss wants you back," the leader said, lowering his rifle slightly. "Alive. We're to take you in." "Fine," she said, taking a few steps closer. "I'll come with you. But you need to get that gold out of here. They'll be on us any minute." Her proximity had the desired effect. They were focused on her, on the bizarre fact of her appearance, their discipline momentarily broken by confusion. And that was all Kangi needed. An arrow hissed out of the silence from above, striking the lead guard in the throat. He gurgled, dropping his rifle, and slid from his saddle. Before a second shot could be fired, Kangi, Chayton, and Wanbli descended from the rocks like avenging spirits. They were not a war party making noise and showing force. They were executioners. Kangi landed behind the coach, his knife flashing, and the 2 men on top tumbled off without a sound. Chayton and Wanbli engaged the outriders. It was a whirlwind of sudden, brutal violence. The canyon echoed with a few frantic gunshots, but it was over in less than a minute. Abigail stood frozen. the rifle trembling in her hands, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. Silence descended once more, broken only by the nervous stamping of the mules. Kangi walked over to the strongbox on the back of the coach. It was locked with a heavy padlock. He looked at Abigail. "There's a key," she said, her voice shaky. "The crew leader wears it on a chain around his neck." Kangi retrieved the key and opened the box. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were gleaming gold coins and bundles of banknotes. The artery was cut. He took out a single coin and tossed it to her. She caught it instinctively. It was heavy cold, the price of men's lives. Now Kangi set his eyes, scanning the back trail from which they came. "We wait for the wolf to come sniffing for his lost bone." They dumped the bodies in a shallow ravine, hid the wagon and mules, and took the strongbox deep into the boneyard. They left behind just enough evidence, a dead horse, a broken wheel, and a single distinctive Lakota arrow to tell a story designed to be read by one man. And they knew Samuel Baxter would be coming soon. For 3 days they waited. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in the center of their camp. Kangi spent his time in silent meditation, sharpening his weapons and his focus until both were razor-thin. Abigail found herself poring over the ledger, not for strategy, but for a deeper understanding of the evil they were fighting. The names and numbers were a litany of ruined lives, each entry a tombstone. She saw her own elegant handwriting and felt a fresh wave of shame. This was a stain she could never wash away, but she could perhaps cauterize the wound. On the 4th day, Chaitan returned from his scouting mission. "He comes," he reported, his voice tight with anticipation. 10 riders. He leads them himself. Samuel Baxter. The name settled over the camp like a shroud. Kangi's knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. This was not about gold or strategy anymore. This was personal. Their trap was laid in a place Kangi called the Spider's Parlor, a narrow, winding canyon that opened into a small box-like basin. There were numerous escape routes for those who knew them, but for intruders it was a killing floor. Abigail's role was the most dangerous. She would be the bait. She was positioned near the entrance to the basin, slumped against a rock as if wounded the empty strongbox beside her. Kangi and his men were hidden in the rocks above, arrows nocked, rifles aimed. The plan was for Baxter to see her, and the box to let his greed and his orders override his caution. He wanted her alive, and he wanted his master's gold. He would have to come into the basin to get them. The sound of hoofbeats arrived first, echoing off the canyon walls. Soon the party of riders appeared, moving cautiously. At their head was a man who was exactly as Abigail remembered him, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. A deep, ugly scar cut across the bridge of his nose. Samuel Baxter rode with the easy arrogance of a man who believed himself to be the apex predator in any environment. He saw her. His hand went up, halting his men. He dismounted his rifle held ready and approached on foot, his men fanning out behind him. "Well, well." Baxter's voice boomed, a gravelly sound that scraped at Abigail's nerves. "Look what the cat dragged in, or what the savages left behind. I gotta say, Miss Hayes, you've led us on a merry chase." Abigail pushed herself up weakly, playing her part. "Baxter," she coughed. They took the gold, killed the whole crew." Baxter's eyes flicked from her to the empty strongbox, then scanned the silent, watchful rocks around them. He was no fool. He was cautious. "And they just left you here," he sneered. My, must have been your lucky day." He took another step closer, his eyes cold and devoid of any pity. "The boss wants his book back, Abigail, and he wants you. He's got some new ideas for your retirement." The threat was clear and vile. Abigail felt a tremor of fear. but she met his gaze. "The book is gone, same as the gold." Baxter chuckled a low, ugly sound. "I don't believe you. You're too smart to lose your only ace. Now you're going to tell me where it is, or we're going to get reacquainted with that branding iron. Maybe a matching mark on the other side." It was the opening Kang-ji had been waiting for. Baxter was close-focused on her, his guard lowered by his own sadism. The first arrow was a blur. It struck the man to Baxter's right, punching through his chest with a sickening thud. Before the man even hit the ground, Kang-ji's rifle cracked from the cliffs above. The shot was a miracle of marksmanship, not aimed at Baxter, but at the rifle in his hands. The bullet struck the wooden stock, shattering it, and sending painful splinters into Baxter's grip. He roared in pain and surprise, dropping the useless weapon. Chaos erupted. Chaitin and Wanbley opened fire from their positions, their shots picking off Baxter's men with deadly precision. The basin became a maelstrom of ricocheting bullets, panicked shouts, and the high, thin scream of wounded horses. Baxter, reacting with pure animal instinct, dove behind a rock, drawing his pistol. He was pinned down, his men falling around him. He had walked straight into a perfectly executed ambush. Abigail scrambled for cover as bullets whizzed past her. The carefully planned trap had devolved into a desperate firefight. Two of Baxter's men, hardened killers, had found cover and were laying down suppressing fire, giving their boss a chance. Then she saw him. Kang-ji. He was no longer on the ridge. He had descended, moving from rock to rock with impossible speed and silence, his knife in one hand, a tomahawk in the other. He was not a soldier fighting from a distance. He was a spirit of vengeance, closing in to deliver the final blow himself. One of the remaining gunmen suddenly cried out, his firing cut short as Wanbley's arrow found its mark. The other turned to see where the threat had come from, and in that moment of distraction, Kang-ji was upon him. It was swift, brutal, and silent. Now only Baxter remained. He crouched behind his rock, firing his pistol wildly toward the cliffs. "Come on, you red-skin coward!" he bellowed. "Face me, I am not the coward here," a voice said, seemingly from right behind him. Baxter spun around, his eyes wide with shock. Kang-ji stood there, not 10 feet away, his face a mask of cold fury. He held no rifle, only the tomahawk. Baxter breathed, recognizing the face from wanted posters, the man they called the Raven, the one from the winter camp. "You remember the faces of the women and children you murder?" Kang-ji asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I remember a whelp with a toy bow," Baxter sneered, raising his pistol. But Kang-ji was already moving. He threw the tomahawk not at Baxter's head, but at his gun hand. The heavy blade spun end over end, the sharpened pole striking Baxter's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol flew from his numb fingers. Baxter screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. He was disarmed, his men dead, his bravado gone, replaced by a primal fear. He stared at the Lakota warrior advancing on him, knife in hand. My son's name was Magaska. Kang-ji said, his voice a low whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. He was closing the distance slowly, deliberately giving Baxter time to savor his terror. My wife's name was Wiake. He lunged. The fight was short and one-sided. Baxter was strong, but he was a bully and a brawler. Kang-ji was a warrior, fueled by years of grief and rage. He moved like a phantom, his knife a blur of silver. Baxter's screams echoed once off the canyon walls and then were abruptly silenced. Kang-ji stood over the body, his chest heaving, the blood of his enemy on his hands. He looked up at the sky, his face unreadable. He had fulfilled half of his vow. The dog was dead. But the master still lived. Abigail emerged from her cover, her rifle held at her side. The basin was still, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. The battle was over. Kangi looked at her, and she saw that the fire in his eyes had not been quenched. It had only been focused. "One down," she said, quietly. Kangi nodded, wiping his blade on the dead man's shirt. Now he said, his gaze turning eastward, toward the heart of the empire he could not see, but could feel like a sickness on the land. "We go after the head of the snake. Killing Baxter did not stop Silas Kane. It only made him bleed, and a wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. Word reached them through traders and trappers of the fury that had descended upon the territory. Kane had doubled the bounties, hired every ruthless gun-for-hire from Deadwood to Dodge City, and put the fear of God into every territorial official on his payroll. The hunt for Abigail Hayes and the renegade Raven became a relentless, scorched earth campaign. But they were hunting ghosts. Kangi, with Abigail's strategic insights, stayed one step ahead. They used the ledger like a holy book, predicting Kane's supply routes, his payrolls, his plans for expansion. They became phantoms of the plains, striking at his assets, freeing indentured laborers from his mines and arming disgruntled homesteaders he was trying to starve out. They weren't just running anymore. They were waging a guerrilla war. They were turning Kane's empire against itself, using his own methods, fear and economic disruption against him. Their names became whispers of legend. To the settlers and natives being crushed under Kane's heel, they were symbols of hope. To Kane's men, they were specters of death. During this time, the bond between Abigail and Kangi deepened into something more profound than a simple alliance. They were two halves of a whole, each providing what the other lacked. In the quiet moments around the campfire, she would read to him from the books she'd salvaged, not the ledger, but novels by Dickens and Twain. And he in turn would tell her the stories of his people, the legends of the stars and the spirits of the land. She found in his culture a peace and a connection to the world she had never known. He saw in her a brilliant mind and a spirit that had refused to be broken, a resilience that mirrored his own. After months of this shadow war, Abigail saw the pattern. "We're hurting him," she said one night, tracing lines on a crude map she'd drawn in the dirt. "We're costing him a fortune, but we're just trimming the branches. He'll always grow new ones. We need to strike at the root." The root was a new town. Kane was building a place he'd arrogantly named Kane's Folly. It was to be the capital of his Western Empire, built around a new, immensely profitable silver mine. It was heavily fortified home to his private army of mercenaries, and according to a frantic series of telegrams detailed in the ledger, Silas Kane himself was coming to oversee the first major silver shipment. "He's coming west," Abigail whispered, a thrill of fear and anticipation running through her. "He's coming out of his palace in St. Louis and into our world." "He feels safe there," Kangi observed, surrounded by his paid killers. "That's his weakness," Abigail countered, her eyes alight with a daring plan. "He believes his fortress is impenetrable. He believes his power is absolute. We're not going to attack the town. We're going to walk right in through the front gate." The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Kane's Folly was celebrating its founding, a grand affair to impress investors and intimidate rivals. Kane would be there, presiding over it all. Abigail, using her knowledge of his business dealings, forged a letter of introduction for a Mr. Stone, a representative of a powerful East Coast banking firm interested in the silver mine. Kangi, who could be stoic and imposing, would be Mr. Stone. Abigail, disguised as a demure secretary, would be his assistant. Chayton and Wanbley would be their hired muscle, dressed as unassuming wranglers. It was a breathtaking gamble. They traded their buckskins and rifles for tailored suits and bowler hats bought in a dusty rail town. Abigail cut and dyed her distinctive red hair a mousy brown. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger looked back. When she saw Kanji in a stiff collar and suit, she saw not a Lakota warrior, but an iron-willed titan of industry, the very kind of man they were fighting. The disguise was terrifyingly perfect. They arrived in Kane's Folly on the day of the celebration. The town was a raw, ugly scar on the landscape, but it was brimming with false gaiety. Banners flew, a brass band played off-key, and the streets were filled with overdressed investors and hard-eyed gunmen. Their forged letter worked like a charm. The name of the East Coast Bank opened every door. They were granted a meeting with Silas Kane himself in his private office above the new assay building, just before the grand ceremony. Walking up those stairs, Abigail's blood ran cold. She was returning to the source of her nightmares. Kangi's hand rested on the concealed pistol tucked into his waistcoat, his calm a stark contrast to her own inner turmoil. They were shown into a lavishly appointed office. And there he was, Silas Kane. He was older than she remembered, thinner, but his eyes were the same, the flat, lifeless grey of a shark. He rose from behind his massive oak desk, a predatory smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Stone?" "A pleasure," Kane said, extending a hand to Kanji. "I trust your journey was acceptable." Kanji took his hand, his grip firm. "It was illuminating, Mr. Kane. You've carved quite an empire for yourself out of the wilderness." Kane's smile widened. "The wilderness provides for those bold enough to take what they want." His eyes then fell on Abigail. He squinted, a flicker of recognition, a predator catching a familiar scent. "And you, my dear, have we met?" This was the moment. Abigail met his gaze, and for the first time in years, she didn't flinch. She reached up and pulled off the wig, letting her newly cut, but still recognizably red hair fall free. "You marked me as your property, Silas," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Did you really think I'd forget my owner?" Kane's face went through a rapid series of transformations, shock, confusion, and then a deep, seething rage. His hand darted for a pistol in his desk drawer. He never made it. Kangi moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman for a man in a suit. He vaulted over the desk, seizing Kane's wrist and slamming it down, shattering the bone. Kane howled in pain. At the same moment, Chayton and Wanbley, standing guard outside, dealt silently with Kane's personal bodyguards. Kangi pressed the barrel of his pistol to Kane's temple. "This meeting is not about banking," he said, his voice dropping back into the cold, deadly tone of the Raven. "The ledger," Abigail said, placing the heavy book on the desk in front of Kane's contorted face. "It's over. I've sent copies to 3 different newspapers and a federal marshal in Chicago. They're set to be delivered tomorrow morning. By the end of the week, your empire will be a feast for vultures." Kane stared at the book, then at her, his face pale with sweat and fury. "You foolish girl," he hissed. "You've ruined us both. You were ruined the day you put your brand on another human being," she retorted. Kangi pushed her back gently. "This is not your fight anymore, Abigail. This is mine." He leaned in close to Kane, his voice a venomous whisper. "You sent a dog named Baxter to my home. He murdered my wife Wiyake and my son Magaska. You signed the order." Kane's eyes widened in a flicker of memory. The squatter village, a business expense. The words sealed his fate. The cold fury in Kanji's eyes became a white-hot inferno. He didn't shoot him. That was too quick, too clean. He dragged the screaming, pleading Silas Kane from the office and out onto the balcony overlooking the town square where the celebration was in full swing. The music stopped. Hundreds of faces turned upward. They saw their great benefactor, the town's founder, held helpless in the grip of a man they thought was an investor. Kanji looked down at the crowd, at the empire of greed and fear Cain had built. And then he looked at Cain. He did not give a speech. He did not declare his reasons. He simply administered the justice of the plains, the justice Silas Cain had dealt out 100 times from the shadows. His knife flashed once quick and deep. Silas Cain's body tumbled over the railing and landed in the dust of the town square that bore his name, a broken puppet whose strings had finally been cut. Silence. Then chaos. Kangi Abigail and the others fought their way out of the town, not as assassins, but as legends leaving the serpent's den to devour itself in the power vacuum they had created. They rode out into the open plains, leaving Cain's folly to its fate, the ledger's truth now an unstoppable firestorm about to sweep across the nation. They had not just killed a man, they had killed an idea. And as they rode toward the setting sun, free for the first time, they knew the world would never be the same. So ends the story of Abigail Hayes and the warrior known as Kangi. Their journey was not simply one of revenge. It was a story forged in the crucible of the American West, a tale of two worlds colliding to fight a common evil. They proved that justice isn't always found in a courtroom, and that the deepest wounds can sometimes forge the strongest bonds. Their tale reminds us that history is not just written by the powerful, but also by the ghosts they create, by the survivors who refuse to be broken. What became of them, some say, Abigail went east, using her formidable mind to help build a more just world, while Kangi returned to his people, a leader who had faced the white man's devil and won. Others whisper, they rode together for years, shadows on the plains, guardians against the darkness that always threatens to swallow the frontier. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. If this story from the heart of the Wild West resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who appreciates tales of grit, justice, and unlikely heroes. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten corners of history. Thank you for listening.